Hello and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Matilda, we had learned some arithmetic from Mr. Wormwood. And now, because he was beastly to Matilda yet again, this is the third time in the book, Matilda's gonna get back at him again. We shall find out what happens in the next 2 chapters. You ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 6. The Platinum Blonde Man. There was no doubt in Matilda's mind that this latest display of foulness by her father deserved severe punishment, and as she sat eating her awful fried fish and fried chips and ignoring the television, her brain went to work on various possibilities. By the time she went up to bed, her mind was made up. The next morning she got up early and went into the bathroom and locked the door. As we already know, Mrs. Wormwood's hair was dyed a brilliant platinum blonde, very much the same glistening silvery color as a female tightrope walker's tights in a circus. The big dyeing job was done twice a year at the hairdresser's, but every month or so in between, Mrs. Wormwood used to freshen it up by giving it a rinse in the wash basin with something called platinum blonde hair dye, extra strong. This also served to dye the nasty brown hairs that kept growing from the roots underneath. The bottle of platinum blonde hair dye extra strong was kept in the cupboard in the bathroom, and underneath the title on the label were written the words, "Caution, this is peroxide. Keep away from children." Matilda had read it many times with fascination. Matilda's father had a fine crop of black hair, which he parted in the middle, of which he was exceedingly proud. "Good strong hair," he was fond of saying, "means there's a good strong brain underneath." "Like Shakespeare," Matilda had once said to him. "Like who?" "Shakespeare, Daddy. Was he brainy?" "Very, Daddy." "He had masses of hair, didn't he?" "He was bald, Daddy." To which Mr. Wormwood had snapped, "If you can't talk sense, then shut up." Anyways, Mr. Wormwood kept his hair looking bright and strong, or so he thought, by rubbing into it every morning large quantities of a lotion called Oil of Violets Hair Tonic. A bottle of this smelly purple mixture always stood on the shelf above the sink in the bathroom alongside all the toothbrushes, and a very vigorous scalp massage with Oil of Violets Hair Tonic took place daily after shaving was completed. This hair and scalp massage was always accompanied by loud, masculine grunts and heavy breathing and gasps of, "Ah, that's better. That's the stuff. Rub it right into the roots," which could be clearly heard by Matilda in her bedroom across the corridor. Now in the early morning privacy of the bathroom, Matilda unscrewed the cap of her father's Oil of Violets Hair Tonic and tipped 3/4 of the contents down the drain. Then she filled the bottle up with her mother's platinum blonde hair dye, extra strong. She carefully left enough of her father's original hair tonic in the bottle so that when she gave it a good shake, the whole thing still looked reasonably purple. She then replaced the bottle on the shelf above the sink, taking care to put her mother's bottle back in the cupboard. So far, so good. At breakfast time, Matilda had sat quietly at the dining room table, eating her cornflakes. Her brother sat opposite her with his back to the door, devouring hunks of bread smothered with a mixture of peanut butter and strawberry jam. Mrs. Wormwood was just out of sight around the corner in the kitchen, making Mr. Wormwood's breakfast, which always had to be 2 fried eggs on fried bread, with 3 pork sausages and 3 strips of bacon and some fried tomatoes. At this point, Mr. Wormwood came noisily into the room. He was incapable of entering any room quietly, especially at breakfast time. He always had to make his appearance felt immediately by creating a lot of noise and clatter. One could almost hear him saying, "It's me, here I come, the great man himself, the master of the house, the wage earner, the one who makes it possible for all of the rest of you to live so well. Notice me and pay your respects." Arrogance. On this occasion, he strode in and slapped his son on the back and shouted, "Well, my boy, your father Eelsy's in for another great money-making day today at the garage. I got a few little beauties I'm going to flog to the idiots this morning. Where's my breakfast? It's coming, treasure, Mrs. Wormwood called from the kitchen. Matilda kept her face bent low over her cornflakes. She didn't dare look up. In the first place, she wasn't at all sure what she was going to see, and secondly, if she did see what she thought she was going to see, she wouldn't trust herself to keep a straight face. Michael was looking directly ahead out of the window, stuffing himself with bread and peanut butter and strawberry jam. Mr. Wormwood was just moving round to sit at the head of the table when Mrs. Wormwood came sweeping out from the kitchen, carrying a huge plate piled high with eggs and sausages and bacon and tomatoes. She looked up. She caught sight of her husband. She stopped dead. Then she let out a scream that seemed to lift her right up into the air, and she dropped the plate with a crash and a splash onto the floor. Everyone jumped, including Mr. Wormwood. "What the heck's the matter with you, woman?" he shouted. "Look at the mess you've made on the carpet." "Your hair," Mrs. Wormwood was shrieking, pointing a quivering finger at her husband. "Look at your hair! What have you done to your hair?" "What's wrong with my hair, for heaven's sake?" he said. "Oh my God, Dad, what have you done to your hair?" Michael shouted. A splendid, noisy scene was building up nicely in the breakfast room. Matilda said nothing. She simply sat there admiring the wonderful effect of her own handiwork. Mr. Wormwood's fine crop of black hair was now a dirty silver, the color this time of a tightrope walker's tights that had not been washed for the entire circus season. You've dyed it!" shrieked Mrs. Wormwood. "Why did you do it, you fool? It looks absolutely frightful. It looks horrendous. You look like a freak." "What the blazes are you all talking about?" Mr. Wormwood yelled, putting both hands to his hair. "I most certainly have not dyed it. What do you mean I've dyed it? What's happened to it? Or is this some sort of a stupid joke?" His face was turning pale green, the color of sour apples. "You must have dyed it, Dad," Michael said. "It looks the same color as Mom's, only much dirtier looking." "Of course he's dyed it," Mrs. Wormwood cried. "It can't change color all by itself." "What on earth were you trying to do? Make yourself look handsome or something? You look like someone's grandmother gone wrong." "Get me a mirror," Mr. Wormwood yelled. "Don't just stand there shrieking at me. Get me a mirror." Mrs. Wormwood's handbag lay on a chair at the other end of the table. She opened the bag and got out a powder compact that had a small round mirror on the inside of the lid. She opened the compact and handed it to her husband. He grabbed it and held it before his face, and in doing so spilled most of the powder all over the front of his fancy tweed jacket. "Be careful!" shrieked Mrs. Wormwood. "Now look what you've done. That's my best Elizabeth Arden face powder." "Oh my God!" yelled Mr. Wormwood, staring into the little mirror. "What's happened to me? I look terrible. I look just like you gone wrong. I can't go down to the garage and sell cars like this. How did it happen?" He stared around the room, first at the mother, then at the son, then at Matilda. "How could it have happened?" he yelled. "I imagine, Daddy," Matilda said quietly, "that you weren't looking very hard and you simply took Mommy's bottle of hair stuff off the shelf instead of your own." "Of course that's what happened," Mrs. Wormwood cried. "Well, really, Harry, how stupid can you get? Why didn't you read the label before you started splashing the stuff all over you? Mine's terribly strong. I'm only meant to use 1 tablespoon of it in a whole basin of water, and you've gone and put it all over your head neat. It'll probably take all your hair off in the end. Is your scalp beginning to burn, dear?" "You mean I'm going to lose all my hair?" Mr. Wormwood yelled. "I think you will," Mrs. Wormwood said. "Peroxide is a very powerful chemical. It's what they put down the lavatory to disinfect the pan, only they give it another name." "What are you saying?" Mr. Wormwood cried. "I'm not a lavatory pan. I don't want to be disinfected." "Even diluted like I use it," Mrs. Wormwood told him. "It makes a good deal of my hair fall out, so goodness knows what's going to happen to you. I'm surprised it didn't take the whole of the top of your head off." "What shall I do?" wailed Mr. Wormwood. "Tell me quick what to do before it starts falling out." Matilda said, "I'd give it a good wash, Dad, if I were you, with soap and water. But you'll have to hurry." "Will that change the color back?" Mr. Wormwood asked anxiously. "Of course it won't, you twit," Mrs. Wormwood said. Then what do I do? I can't go around looking like this forever. You'll have to have it dyed back, Mrs. Ormond said. But wash it first so there won't be any there to dye. Right, Mr. Ormond shouted, springing to action. Get me an appointment with your hairdresser this instant for a hair dyeing job. Tell them it's an emergency. They gotta boot someone else off their list. I'm going upstairs to wash it now. With that, the man dashed out of the room, and Mrs. Wormwood sighed deeply. Sighing deeply, went to the telephone to call the beauty parlor. He does do some pretty silly things now and again, doesn't he, Matilda said. Mrs. Wormwood, dialing on the number on the phone, said, I'm afraid men are not always quite as clever as they think they are. It's true. I admit it. You will learn that when you get a bit older, my girl. Chapter 7. Miss Honey. Matilda was a little late in starting school. Most children begin primary school at 5 or even just before, but Matilda's parents, who weren't very concerned one way or another about their daughter's education, had forgotten to make the proper arrangements in advance. She was 5.5 when she entered school for the first time. The village school for younger children was a bleak black brick building called Trunchbull Primary School. It had about 250 pupils aged from 5 to just under 12 years old. The head teacher, the boss, the supreme commander of this establishment was a formidable middle-aged lady whose name was Miss Trunchbull. Naturally, Matilda was put in the bottom class, where there were 18 other small boys and girls about the same age as her. Their teacher was called Miss Honey, and she could not have been more than 23 or 24. She had a lovely, pale, oval Madonna face, with blue eyes, and her hair was light brown. Her body was so slim and fragile, one got the feeling that if she fell over, she would smash into 1,000 pieces, like a porcelain figure. Miss Jennifer Honey was a mild and quiet person who never raised her voice and was seldom seen to smile, but there is no doubt she possessed that rare gift for being adored by every small child under her care. She seemed to understand totally the bewilderment and fear that so often overwhelms young children who for the first time in their lives are herded into a classroom and told to obey orders. Some curious warmth that was almost tangible shone out of Miss Honey's face, and when she spoke to a confused and homesick newcomer to the class, Miss Trunchbull, the head mistress, was something else altogether. She was a gigantic holy terror, a fierce tyrannical monster who frightened the life out of the pupils and teachers alike. There was an aura of menace about her even at a distance, and when she came up close you could almost feel the dangerous heat radiating from her from a red-hot rod of metal. When she marched, Miss Trunchbull never walked. She always marched like a stormtrooper with long strides and arms a-swinging. When she marched along a corridor, you could actually hear her snorting as she went, and if a group of children happened to be in her path, she plowed right on through them like a tank, with small people bouncing off her to left and right. Thank goodness we don't meet many people like her in this world, although they do exist, and all of us are likely to come across at least one of them in a lifetime. If you ever do, you should behave as you would if you met an enraged rhinoceros out in the bush. Climb up the nearest tree and stay until it is gone away. This woman, in all her eccentricities and in her appearance, is almost impossible to describe, but I shall make some attempt to do so later on. Let us leave her for the moment and go back to Matilda and her first day in Miss Honey's class. After the usual business of going through all the names of the children, Miss Honey handed out a brand new exercise book to each pupil. You have all brought your own pencils, I hope, she said. Yes, Miss Honey, they chanted. Good. Now this is the very first day of school for each one of you. It is the beginning of at least 11 long years of schooling that all of you are going to have to go through, and 6 of those years will be spent right here at Cruncham Hall, where, as you know, your head mistress is Miss Trunchbull. Let me, for your own good, tell you something about Miss Trunchbull. She insists upon strict discipline throughout the school, and if you take my advice, you will do your very best to behave yourselves in her presence. Never argue with her, never answer her back, always do as she says. If you get on the wrong side of Miss Trunchbull, she can liquidize you like a carrot in a kitchen blender. It's nothing to laugh about, Lavender. Take that grin off your face. All of you will be wise to remember that Miss Trunchbull deals very, very severely with anyone who gets out of line in this school. Have you got the message? Yes, Miss Honey, chirruped 18 eager little voices. I myself, Miss Honey went on, want to help you learn as much as possible while you are in this class. That is because I know it will make things easier for you later on. For example, by the end of this week, I shall expect every one of you to know the 2 times table learned by heart. I didn't learn multiplication until I was 8. And in a year's time, I hope you will know all the multiplication tables up to 12. It will help you enormously if you do. Now then, do any of you happen to have learned the 2 times table already? Matilda put up her hand. She was the only one. Miss Honey looked carefully at the tiny girl with dark hair and a round, serious face sitting in the second row. Wonderful, she said. Please stand up and recite as much as you can. Matilda stood up and began to say the 2 times table. When she got to twice 12 is 24, the standard, she didn't stop. She went right on with twice 13 is 26, twice 14 is 28, twice 15 is 30, twice 16 is 32. Stop, Miss Honey said. She had been listening slightly spellbound to this smooth recital, and now she said, How far can you go? How far? Matilda said. Oh, I don't really know, Miss Honey. For quite a long way, I think. Miss Honey took a few moments to let this curious statement sink in. You mean, she said, that you could tell me what 2 times 28 is? Yes, Miss Honey. What is it? 56, Miss Honey. What about something much harder, like 2 times 487? Could you tell me that? I think so. Yes, Matilda said. Are you sure? Yes, why yes, Miss Honey, I'm fairly sure. What is it then? 2 times 487. 974, Matilda said immediately. She spoke quietly and politely, and without any sign of showing off. That's the way to do it. Miss Honey gazed at Matilda with an absolute amazement, but when she next spoke, she kept her voice level. That is really splendid indeed, she said. But of course, multiplying by 2 is a lot easier than some of the bigger numbers. It is. What about the other multiplication tables? Do you know any of those? I think so, Miss Honey. I think I do. Which ones, Matilda? How far have you got? I don't quite know, Matilda said. I don't know what you mean. What I mean is, do you for instance know the 3 times table? Yes, Miss Honey. And the 4 times table? Yes, Miss Honey. Well, how many do you know, Matilda? Do you know all the way up to the 12 times table? Yes, Miss Honey. What's 12 times 7? 84, Matilda said. Miss Honey paused and leaned back in her chair behind the plain table that stood in the middle of the floor in front of the class. She was considerably shaken by this exchange, but took care not to show it. Can you blame her? She had never come across a 5-year-old before, or indeed a 10-year-old who could multiply with such facility. I hope the rest of you are listening to this, she said to the class. Matilda is a very lucky girl. She has wonderful parents who have already taught her to multiply lots of numbers. Was it your mother, Matilda, who taught you? No, Miss Honey, it wasn't. You must have a great father, then. He must be a brilliant teacher. No, Miss Honey, Matilda said quietly. My father did not teach me. You mean you taught yourself? I don't quite know, Matilda said truthfully. It's just that I don't find it very difficult to multiply one number by another. Miss Honey took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She looked again at the small girl with bright eyes standing beside her desk, so sensible and solemn. You say you don't find it difficult to multiply one number by another, Miss Honey said. Could you try to explain that a little bit? Oh dear, Matilda said. I'm not really sure. Miss Honey waited. The class was silent, all listening. For instance, Miss Honey said, if I asked you to multiply 14 by 19... No, that's too difficult. It's 266, Matilda said softly. Miss Honey stared at her. Then she picked up a pencil and quickly worked out the sum on a piece of paper. What did you say it was, she said, looking up. 266, Matilda said. Miss Honey put down her pencil and removed her spectacles and began to polish the lenses with a piece of tissue. The class remained quiet, watching her and waiting for what was coming next. Matilda was still standing up beside her desk. Now tell me, Matilda, Miss Honey said, still polishing. Try to tell me exactly what goes on inside your head when you get a multiplication like that to do. You obviously have to work it out in some way, but you seem able to arrive at the answer almost instantly. Take the one you've just done. 14 multiplied by 19. I simply put the 14 down in my head and multiplied by 19, Matilda said. I'm afraid I don't know how else to explain it. I've always said to myself that if a little pocket calculator can do it, why shouldn't I? Why not indeed, Miss Honey said. The human brain is an amazing thing. I think it's a lot better than a lump of metal, Matilda said. That's all a calculator is. How right you are, Miss Honey said. Pocket calculators are not allowed in this school anyway. Miss Honey was feeling quite quivery. There was no doubt in her mind that she had met a truly extraordinary mathematical brain, and words like child genius and prodigy went flittering through her head. She knew that these sort of wonders do pop up in the world from time to time, but only once or twice in 100 years. After all, Mozart was only 5. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was only 5 when he started composing for the piano, and look what happened to him. It's not fair, Lavender said. How can she do it and we can't? Don't worry, Lavender, you'll soon catch up, Miss Honey said, lying through her teeth. At this point, Miss Honey could not resist the temptation of exploring still further the mind of this astonishing child. She knew that she ought to be paying some attention to the rest of the class, but she was altogether too excited to let the matter rest. Well, she said, pretending to address the whole class, let us leave sums for the moment and see if any of you have begun to learn to spell. Hands up, anyone who can spell cat. 3 hands went up. They belonged to Lavender, a small boy called Nigel, and to Matilda. Spell cat, Nigel. Nigel spelled it. Miss Honey now decided to ask a question that normally she would not have dreamed of asking the class on its first day. I wonder, she said, whether any of you 3 who know how to spell cat have learned to read a whole group of words when they are strung together in a sentence. I have, Nigel said. So have I, Lavender said. Miss Honey went to the blackboard and wrote with her white chalk the sentence, I have already begun to learn how to read long sentences. 11 words. She had purposefully made it difficult, and she knew that there were precious few 5-year-olds around who would be able to manage it. Can you tell me what it says, Nigel? She asked. That's too hard, Nigel said. Lavender, the first word is I, Lavender said. Can any of you read the whole sentence? Miss Honey asked, waiting for the yes that she felt certain was going to come from Matilda. Yes, Matilda said. Go ahead, Miss Honey said. Matilda read the sentence without any hesitation at all. That really is very good indeed, Miss Honey said, making the understatement of her life. How much can you read, Matilda? I think I can read most things, Miss Honey, Matilda said, although I'm afraid I can't always understand the meanings. Miss Honey got to her feet and walked smartly out of the room, but was back in 30 seconds carrying a thick book. She opened it at random and placed it on Matilda's desk. This is a book of humorous poetry, she said. See if you can read that one aloud. Smoothly, without a pause, and at a nice speed, Matilda began to read. An epicure dining at Crewe found a rather large mouse in his stew. Cried the waiter, don't shout, and wave it about, or the rest will be wanting one too. Several children saw the funny side of the rhyme, and laughed. Miss Honey said, Do you know what an epicure is, Matilda? It is someone who is dainty with his eating. Like a picky eater, Matilda said. That is correct, Miss Honey said. And do you happen to know what that particular type of poetry is called? It's called a limerick, Matilda said. That's a lovely one. It's so funny. I know another funny one I know from SpongeBob. There once was a man from Peru who dreamed he was eating his shoe. He woke with a fright in the middle of the night to find that his dream had come true. That's the first limerick I ever learned, actually. It's a famous one, Miss Honey said, picking up the book and returning to her table in front of the class. A witty limerick is very hard to write, she added. They look easy, but they most certainly are not. I know, Matilda said. I've tried quite a few times, but mine are never any good. You have you? Miss Honey said, more startled than ever. Well, Matilda, I would very much like to hear one of the limericks you say you have written. Could you try to remember one for us? Well, Matilda said, hesitating, I've actually been trying to make one up about you, Miss Honey, while we've been sitting here. About me? Miss Honey cried. Well, we've certainly got to hear that one, haven't we? I don't think I want to say it, Miss Honey. Please tell it, Miss Honey said. I promise I won't mind. I think you will, Miss Honey, because I have to use your first name to make things rhyme, and that's why I don't want to say it. How do you know my first name? Miss Honey asked. I heard another teacher calling you by it just before we came in, Matilda said. She called you Jenny. Of course, Jenny is a nickname for Jennifer. I insist upon hearing this limerick, Miss Honey said, smiling one of her rare smiles. Stand up and recite it. Reluctantly, Matilda stood up and very slowly, very nervously, she recited her limerick. The thing we all ask about Jenny is surely there cannot be many young girls in the place with so lovely a face. The answer to that is not any. Not bad for a 5-year-old prodigy. The whole of Miss Honey's face his pale and pleasant face had blushed a brilliant